All right, let's jump right in. Today, we're talking about a huge turning point in history, the Regulating Act of 1773. And this wasn't just some dusty old piece of legislation. No, this was the very first time the British Parliament decided to step in and take control of the East India Company's massive, sprawling empire in India. It really set the stage for everything that came next, what we now call the British Raj.
But what made Parliament do it? Well, it all boils down to this one massive, mind-bending question. How on earth does a trading company that's conquering land and ruling millions go broke? And at the same time, how are its employees coming back to England just fantastically, obscenely wealthy? It's a paradox, right? And it's that staggering contradiction that forced the British government's hand.
And just how bad was the situation? Get this. In 1772, the East India Company, a powerhouse that controlled the immense wealth of Bengal, had to go to the British government and ask for a loan for £1 million. I mean, that's an absolutely astronomical amount of money back then. It was basically a giant public admission that something inside the company was broken, deeply broken. So before we can really dig into the act itself, we've got to understand the crisis that sparked it. And trust me, it's a story packed with unchecked power, unbelievable greed, and just total chaos.
The company was, for all intents and purposes, rotting from the inside. You had this crippling financial crisis, which was being fueled by just rampant corruption. The whole system of government they'd set up was a complete disaster. And all the while, back in London, Parliament was under more and more pressure to finally, do something.
And this brings us to the Nabobs. It was kind of this sarcastic nickname for the company officials who were sailing back to England with just enormous fortunes. See, they were getting rich doing their own private trading on the side and taking massive bribes, all while the company that employed them was bleeding money. You can probably guess this caused a huge public scandal back in Britain.
Now, at the heart of this whole administrative meltdown was a really weird system they called the dual government. Okay, try to imagine this. The company gets to collect all the taxes, all the money. But the local Indian ruler, the Nawab, he's responsible for keeping law and order, running the courts, and defending the territory. It created a situation where all the power was in one person's hands and all the responsibility was in another's. It was a recipe for disaster, and for the people of Bengal, it was absolutely catastrophic. So, you've got a bankrupt company, a territory in complete chaos, and growing public anger back home. The British government finally realized it couldn't just stand by and watch. It had to step in. And this, right here, is a massive turning point.
And that intervention was the Regulating Act of 1773. We really need to pause and appreciate how revolutionary this was. For the first time ever, a national government was officially taking control over a private company's empire. Nothing like this had ever happened before. It was completely new territory.
So what did this act actually do? Well, it was basically an attempt to create a whole new government framework from the ground up. The goal was to replace all that chaos with a clear, accountable structure. So here's the new power structure they came up with. At the top, they created a new position, the Governor General of Bengal. The very first one was a guy named Warren Hastings. He was supposed to work with a council of 4 members. And here's the key part. The other big British centers in India, Madras and Bombay, were now officially under Bengal's authority. This was the real start of a centralized British government in India.
Let's break down some of the other big changes. A brand new Supreme Court was set up in Calcutta, so now British subjects had a formal legal system. To try and stop the Nabob problem, all company employees were flat-out banned from private trading or taking bribes. And to make sure Parliament knew what was going on, the company was now required to report all of its financial and administrative business directly to the government. You can see how each rule was a direct shot at fixing one of the big problems.
So was it the perfect solution? Not even close. It's probably best to think of the Regulating Act as a flawed first draft. A really important, historic attempt for sure, but one that came with some pretty serious issues. So let's look at the final scorecard. On the plus side, it was the first real move towards government control, and it absolutely laid the groundwork for a central administration. But the flaws were huge. The Governor General could actually be overruled by his own council, which sometimes left him totally powerless. Nobody was quite sure who the Supreme Court had power over, which led to a lot of infighting. And maybe the biggest flaw of all, the interests of the actual Indian people were pretty much completely ignored in the whole thing. So the most important thing to remember is this. The Regulating Act wasn't the final answer. Not at all. It was the first domino to fall.
It marked the beginning of the end for the East India Company's free reign and the true, formal beginning of British India.
And you can see how things evolved from here. Just over a decade later, in 1784, Parliament passed Pitt's India Act. This new law was designed specifically to fix the weaknesses of the 1773 Act, tightening government control even more. It proves that the Regulating Act, with all its problems, was the necessary, messy first step that made everything else possible.
Which really leaves us with one last big question to think about. Was the Regulating Act a genuine attempt to reform a corrupt, broken system? Or was it just the British government figuring out a smarter, more efficient way to control its incredibly valuable and incredibly chaotic colonial prize? The answer, like most of history, is, well, it's complicated.